introduction, and appreciate everyone who logged on today and for your attention. I'll start by saying this was, so what I'm presenting today is as Andrew mentioned, it's really results from a synthesis that was published last year in Forest Ecology and Management. And I did this with my co-author, Marcos Robles, who's with the Nature Conservancy here in Arizona. And this work was funded and supported by the Joint Fire Science Program. And I really did it in that role of science advisor for the program, which is again one of the many hats that I wear. But anyway, this is the link to the paper and other which should also be in the chat. So I want to start by kind of setting up the premise for the why that we thought this was an important study to do. And part of what we know from the scientific literature is, of course, there's ample benefits to the use of prescribed fire. So that includes things like, improvement of wildlife habitat, cultural resources, rangeland productions, all of those things that there's obvious benefits to the use of prescribed fire. But also it comes with certain costs, right? And one of the most obvious and probably one that acts as the biggest barrier, of course, is the influence of prescribed fire on air quality, for example, which can have implications for human health. So there are both kind of costs and benefits associated with prescribed fire. Another obvious benefit that's been really documented in the literature with prescribed fire is that it can both kind of increase the benefits and decrease the costs that are associated with wildfire. That is the case when they actually interact. So prescribed fire can reduce the severity of wildfire when they encounter each other. It could also open up opportunities to better suppress wildfire, things like that nature. So when they interact, there's also those benefits to prescribed fire. And both those things are well documented in the literature, and we're pretty confident that those are true. And for that reason, many have called for managers to increase the pace and scale of prescribed fire so that we could, in order for us to really have an impact on wildfire regimes and reducing the negative impacts of wildfire that we're seeing, we really need to increase the scale of prescribed fire. But that begs this question that's a little bit more difficult to answer, which is, how much prescribed fire do we need? And it's important to address that question because the more you increase it, you do increase the benefits, but you are also kind of increasing those costs. So there are trade-offs between with increasing prescribed fire regimes. And we really need to kind of understand how much is needed to really influence wildfire regimes and what are going to be the trade-offs for, effects of wildfire and prescribed fire to ecosystems and society. And of course, in the past, we've used historical fire regimes as a guide to, perhaps how much prescribed fire might be needed in an ecosystem. But that in and of itself, we argue, is not necessarily a great tool for kind of understanding how much prescribed fire is needed, because managers are, dealing with multiple land management objectives and also trying to balance that with the impacts of these regimes to society and to ecosystems. So historical fire regimes can be a guide, but really there needs to be more information on what the implications of increasing prescribed fire are going to be to other ecosystem processes and factors and to society. And so we kind of argue that in order to help address this question of how much more prescribed fire should be implemented in any given landscape, we need to do kind of a much more robust analysis of the trade-offs between prescribed fire and wildfire regimes. And to do that, we kind of offer this sort of conceptual diagram for how these things, I think, should be looked at. And mainly that really, we think, looking at prescribed fire and wildfire regimes and their trade-offs should be analyzed at much broader temporal and spatial scales. In other words, we shouldn't necessarily be looking at the kind of comparing one prescribed fire to one wildfire, but really looking at the cumulative effects of wildfire and prescribed fire over time. And we try to sort of use this conceptual figure to sort of describe that. So this is showing, you know, very hypothetical, very simple landscape, looking at both wildfire, which is included in the sort of purple blobs there, and different types of prescribed fire. So you have your kind of single entry fire, perhaps maintenance burns, and then older prescribed fires that might still maintain some of their benefits even years after they're conducted. And one of the things we try to show here is that these things operate at different scales, right? So wildfires, at least the most impactful ones, tend to be larger and less frequent compared to prescribed fire, you know, which under, you know, perhaps ideal management conditions are occurring at a smaller scale usually, but with greater frequency. So that's why looking at broader spatial and temporal scales is really important for kind of comparing these different types of fire. And if we look at kind of past studies looking at prescribed fire and wildfire, they tend to operate at this more narrow scale. So, you know, it might be the case where a wildfire is burned over an area that's previously been treated with prescribed fire, and a study will look at, you know, the effects of those different treatments, you know, looking at areas within the prescribed fire footprint and outside the prescribed fire footprint. Or perhaps the study will look at prescribed fire and some of the implications for wildlife habitat or other ecosystem services and compare that to unburned areas. So that's kind of what the literature oftentimes in the past has focused on. And from that, we know, you know, the first two bullets I presented earlier is that prescribed fire is beneficial for a number of factors, including kind of influencing the severity of wildfire. But the reality is it's important to really kind of zoom out and look at these things at larger scales, because really any given wildfire is likely to be impacted not just by one prescribed fire, but multiple prescribed fires over a period of time, you know, including maintenance treatments. And so we should be thinking about it more in that context. And then also kind of looking out, expanding out in space, there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, as to where wildfires are going to occur on the landscape. And there's no guarantee that you're going to get that interaction between the prescribed fire and the wildfire. So, which is why many have argued we really need to increase the pace of prescribed fire in spatial scale as well to kind of increase the chances that it's going to interact with wildfire. And some studies indeed have shown that, you know, the rates of encounter between prescribed fire and wildfire increase a lot when the pace of any of those treatments, either prescribed fire or wildfire, is much greater. So so we kind of use this as our framework going forward. This is kind of the scale at which we need to be thinking about this issue. So kind of in that context, these were the specific objectives of this synthesis. So we're looking at kind of compiling the literature that looks at the trade-offs between prescribed fire and wildfire regimes. And that term regimes there is really critical here. So that means we're not looking at studies that really kind of only compare individual events, but really studies that include kind of multiple and the accumulation of prescribed fire and wildfire over space and time. So just only looking at studies that kind of take that bigger approach and perspective. We included both empirical and simulation modeling studies. So by empirical, it just basically mean, you know, studies that are using historical data to kind of look at relationships between prescribed fire and wildfire, in some cases kind of building statistical models based on that data, versus simulation modeling studies. Those are studies that are using, you know, more mechanistic landscape models that are kind of simulating disturbance and vegetation growth and climate and things of that nature. So, and both of those are important. We don't mean to kind of emphasize one or the other. They both are have their advantages and disadvantages, but we sort of separated them out in our analysis here. And then for each of the studies, we sort of compiled how they defined the implications of changing prescribed fire regimes for both wildfire metrics, and also some of them that kind of extended those metrics to look at what are the implications for ecosystems and society. And a couple caveats. So, you know, the focus of here was sort of was prescribed fire, but we also included those studies that looked at prescribed fire that was preceded by some kind of thinning or mechanical treatment, because we, you know, acknowledge that that's a very common practice. But we didn't look at studies that only looked at a mechanical treatment that was not followed up with the prescribed fire. And then we also acknowledge the importance of using wildfire itself as to kind of increase the pace of good fire on a landscape. And so in our case, when we say prescribed fire in this study, we included wildfire that's used for resource benefit. You know, again, just acknowledging that that's an important management approach now. But of course, we were really only able to do that when the investigators themselves really explicitly, you know, pull that out of a study. So, and then finally, we looked at, you know, didn't exclude any vegetation type or any region or any country. We just kind of tried to look at all of the literature that we could find that really addresses trade-offs between prescribed fire and wildfire at larger scales. So for each of the studies that we compiled, all of them take, you know, very different approaches and very different metrics to describe, you know, a wildfire prescribed fire regime. So in order to sort of ease the ability for us to compare across studies and to kind of summarize findings, we grouped a lot of these different metrics according to these categories. So we looked at wildfire frequency, wildfire extent, total area burned, and wildfire behavior / severity. So wildfire frequency, just we define as describing in some way how often wildfire occurs, and regardless of its size or its behavior. So, and then in the final column there, it just shows some examples of metrics, specific metrics that were used in different studies to kind of define or describe wildfire frequency. So that included things like wildfire incidence, occurrence rate, burn probability, return interval, things like that. Wildfire extent just is something that describes the you know, the area or the size of wildfire spread, and again, regardless of its behavior. So some of the metrics that were used in study to describe that were wildfire extent, percent landscape burned, average wildfire size, and sometimes that could be, you know, sort of shown over an annual basis or a cumulative basis. And then total area burned is the size or extent of area burned in both prescribed fire and wildfire. So those two things combined. And we included that because some studies did, and it became, you know, an important metric, especially when sort of examining the trade-offs in terms of carbon and emissions, for example. And then wildfire behavior / severity includes some aspect of fire behavior. And in this category, we also included at least the immediate fire severity. So, you know, as it's measured by usually consumption or damage to the dominant vegetation. So that included probability of high severity fire, potential flame length, amount of stand replacing fire, travel time, so things of that nature. And again, so some of our studies, you know, only looked at kind of the implications for prescribed fire to fire regimes, and then some sort of extended that to looking at what are then the implications of a changing wildfire regime to some ecosystem or societal response. So, and again, the actual metrics used were very different across studies. So we attempted to kind of to put some categories around them so that we could do some more analysis. So the specific categories we came up with were ecosystem carbon pools, ecosystem carbon fluxes, wildfire emissions, total emissions, and watershed. And then there's more on the next slide, but these were the most common ones. So ecosystem carbon pools include just the state of above or below ground carbon or biomass. So some of the specific metrics that were used in studies included fuel load, biomass, carbon, basal area, total ecosystem carbon. Ecosystem carbon fluxes describe more the rate of ecosystem carbon exchange and especially the degree to which a system operates as a carbon source or a carbon sink. So some examples of that include net ecosystem change and ecosystem carbon balance. Wildfire emissions are the release of carbon or other byproducts of combustion from wildfire. So that included metrics like wildfire emissions, carbon loss from wildfire, and then total emissions were sort of the combined release of carbon or other byproducts of combustion from both wildfire and prescribed fire combined. And then watershed refers to kind of the wildfire effects on watershed services and processes. So that included things like sediment yield and runoff. And then there were a host of other kind of wildfire effects metrics that were less studied, but still we found a handful of studies that looked at these. One was wildland urban interface, which is really just the direct effects of wildfire on communities. And that was measured by things like burn probability near structures, area burned in wildland urban interface, or structures, number of structures 1 kilometer from fire. So very different metrics, but all kind of getting at what are the direct impacts to communities. Suppression refers to kind of the influence of prescribed fire on the efficiency and effectiveness of suppression resources for wildfire. So most commonly that was looked at by this first metric, suppression costs, but there were a few others that also kind of tried to get at this idea of what are the impacts in terms of suppression efficiency and effectiveness. For economics, we refer that to kind of the direct economic effects of wildfire. And some of the metrics used were financial return, net present value, economic impact, and expected value change. Wildlife refers to kind of the influence of wildfire on wildlife habitat or on populations. And so some of the metrics that investigators used there were habitat loss, area of high quality habitat, burn probability, and wildlife habitat and population size. And then finally, there were a few studies that also tried to understand kind of the effects of wildfire in terms of resilience. And so we define that here just as the ability of a system to recover from wildfire without really fundamental changes in ecosystem processes or structures. And some of the metrics that were used to describe that were area of resilient forest structure. In some cases, they looked at the amount of drought tolerant or fire tolerant vegetation, and also the area of ecosystem shift. So for example, area that maybe shifted from forest to non-forest as a result of a fire. Okay, so in all, we found 71 papers that sort of met our criteria for looking at wildfire and prescribed fire regimes at these larger scales. And some of those papers included multiple study sites or multiple sort of areas of analysis. And we found studies across 36 different countries. And most of the studies you could see kind of concentrated in the Western United States. But there were also a fair number of studies that were conducted in other parts of North America, as well as European countries and Australia. And again, like I said, we sort of separated our results from these different studies by whether or not studies kind of addressed the issue either empirically or with simulation models. So these first few graphs are looking at the findings from empirical models. And there were fewer studies that were able to address these questions empirically. I think it was in the low 20s, but some of those studies had multiple study sites as well. So for each of these graphs, I'll just kind of go over how we how we sort of categorize things. For each of the wildfire regime metric categories, we sort of labeled it, the results in 3 different ways that are seen at the top there. So we have treatment effect decrease, treatment effect, no treatment effect, and treatment effect increase. And what we're comparing there are sort of what are the ultimate effects of the prescribed fire regime, either implementation of prescribed fire regime or increasing prescribed fire for the wildfire metric. So in this first case of wildfire frequency, we had 4 studies that found a decrease in wildfire frequency as a result of increased prescribed fire or implementing prescribed fire. And there were 2 studies that showed no effect of a prescribed fire regime on wildfire frequency, and 0 studies that found an increase in wildfire frequency as a result of implementing some prescribed fire regime. So that's kind of the the convention that we use throughout the rest of the results to try to summarize things. So anyway, for this case, in terms of the empirical studies, most of them found that implementing prescribed fire or increasing prescribed fire resulted in a decrease in a number of these wildfire regime metrics. So that included fire frequency, fire extent, and wildfire behavior. And then there were only a couple studies that addressed this question of what are the implications for total area burned. And again, that's kind of the combination of both prescribed fire and wildfire. And both of those found that increasing the scale of prescribed fire led to an increase in total area burned on the landscape. And that's not very many studies finding that result, but it's still an important result, I think, because it gets at that sort of trade-off that we need to face, I think, and that in some systems you might need much more prescribed fire, much more fire than you see on a landscape now to really influence a wildfire regime. Now, for each of these, I thought I would also kind of just include an example of one study that's sort of included in this analysis to give you a better sense of the kind of findings that we looked at. So here's one example of an empirical study from Georgia at Fort Benning, where they took a 30-year record of wildfire and prescribed fire and looked at relationships between those. So this is showing annual wildfire incidence as a function of cumulative prescribed fire area and also kind of overlaid with the drought index. And they found that when they compiled all that data, that indeed kind of increasing the scale of prescribed fire does result in a decrease in wildfire incidence. And that's true even in conditions where you have significant drought. Okay, there were fewer studies that looked at kind of extended the results of wildfire regimes to wildfire effects, but there were some empirical studies that did this, and most of them really focused on effects in terms of wildfire emissions and total emissions. And some of them showed some conflicting results, probably mostly because they use very different methodologies for trying to assess this. But in the studies that we found, there were folks found either a decrease in wildfire emissions or no effect of prescribed fire on wildfire emissions and total emissions in different areas. And there were fewer studies that looked at some of these other impacts like watershed economics and resilience, only one, but they're in the right direction in terms of if we're looking for the benefits of wildfire, and that showed that prescribed fire resulted in a decrease in the potential watershed impacts from wildfire, a decrease in the economic losses, and an increase in resilience. But again, very few studies that really looked at some of those other effects. Okay, so here's one example of an empirical study that looks at the implications of sort of a changing prescribed fire regime for wildfire and total emissions. So this comes from several Mediterranean countries where they estimated prescribed fire and wildfire emissions from 1980 to 2008, and then also used data on past fire to calculate burning leverage, which is really just you know, the sort of the bang for the buck you get with prescribed fire. It's the amount of decrease in wildfire you can expect with increasing fire. And they do that by just looking at the slope of the relationship between, you know, past fire and more recent fire. So from that, they kind of developed a statistical model and then estimated total emissions and wildfire and prescribed fire emissions under different scenarios of increasing prescribed fire and increasing prescribed fire leverage. So these different scenarios are just, you know, as they go from left to right, they're just showing representing increasing levels of prescribed fire or increased leverage from prescribed fire, or both. You know, so that final scenario there on the all the way on the right hand side shows the scenario with the most prescribed fire and the highest leverage prescribed fire. And if that really only in that scenario did you see a significant decrease in total emissions from that prescribed burning regimes. Otherwise, there's really no effect of prescribed fire on the wildfire emissions. Okay, so on to the simulation modeling studies. Again, sort of same convention that we're using to describe the results. And we found very similar results in these studies compared to the empirical ones, and that most found that implementing a prescribed fire regime or increasing prescribed fire results in decreased wildfire frequency, extent, and behavior. And also similar in terms of total area burned. Again, fewer studies are really looking at that metric, but there is some indication that at least in some areas, you know, increasing prescribed fire might, to the point where it influences wildfire, might actually mean you have more total fire on the landscape. And again, here's an example of a study from Australia. So in this case, they use the model Firescape to simulate fire regimes under various climate change and prescribed fire scenarios. So the graphs here are just showing results from a couple of different regions in Australia, showing median annual area burned and median fire incidence with increasing sort of area burned in prescribed fire. And the different lines there are just representing different climate change scenarios. But you can see the trends there that, you know, as you increase the rate of burning, you're decreasing both wildfire incidence and area. Now, in terms of sort of extending those results to look at what are the potential effects of those changing wildfire regimes. Again, this is somewhat similar into the empirical studies in that we found most studies are looking specifically at implications for carbon and emissions. And also found fairly conflicting results. So all studies did find, or not all, but most did find a significant reduction in wildfire emissions as a result of increasing prescribed fire. But in turn, what that means for carbon pools and fluxes and total emissions was quite conflicting across studies. And in some cases, this probably, we think, has to do with just the different methodologies that were used across studies in terms of models used, the parameters used in models, the assumptions, and a whole host of things. Because even in some cases, we would find studies in the same region or ecosystem type that had very conflicting results. So a lot of this, I think, has to do with just with differences in methodologies. But here's another example of a study that kind of looked at the implications of prescribed fire for emissions. This is from the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, and the investigators here used Landis to simulate fire regimes and ecosystem carbon under different management and fire weather scenarios. So this is showing cumulative emissions from both wildfire and prescribed fire under different management scenarios. You have no management, a thin only scenario, and a scenario that includes thinning and maintenance burning. And they're looking at it for two different sort of weather distributions. One that they call contemporary, which is just sort of taking a weather distribution, 10-year weather distribution from the particular area and applying that in the model. And another is looking at a more extreme weather scenario where they take a more narrow weather distribution that came from one particular extreme year in this study area. And in that case, they found that really only under those extreme weather conditions did the prescribed fire regime implementing that result in a reduction in total emissions. Otherwise, it didn't have any impact. And then also, similar to our empirical studies, we found fewer that are looking at some of those other potential effects of wildfire and what prescribed fire regimes might mean for them. But there were some. So we found, for example, a few studies that looked at the implications for changing wildfire regimes on wildlife and did find conflicting results. But really, we found that that was really more of a case of just the particular species that were investigated and the degree to which they are, adapted to fire. I think we know there are sort of winners and losers in terms of wildlife and their impacts to fire. But for all of the other sort of categories of metrics that we looked at, while there weren't a lot of studies, again, they were all kind of in that positive direction, or at least kind of indicating benefits of prescribed fire. So we found, for example, prescribed fire resulted in decreased impacts to WUI, decreased economic losses as a result of fire, decreased suppression costs, decreased watershed impacts, and increases in resilience. Again, fewer studies looking at all of those things, but they all sort of trend in the same direction. So again, here's one example of that, of a study that sort of looked at that. This was from a fire-prone landscape in Oregon. In this case, they used Envision, another model to simulate outcomes of our alternative management strategies. And the graphs here are showing the area in their analysis that was what they defined as high resilience forest versus low resilient forest for different management scenarios. And the blue and the black lines there represent sort of what we would call the prescribed burning scenario, either maintaining existing treatments or accelerating treatments, whereas the other lines represent kind of decreases or eliminating prescribed fire. And you can see there, in this case, the prescribed fire scenario resulted in a higher incidence of high resilient forest, which they define here as just sort of the particular structure that is more akin to historical forest conditions. Okay, so just to conclude here, overall, I think we've shown that, of the literature that's looking at these things at large scales, that increasing prescribed fire does result in ample benefits, at least in terms of, reducing the wildfire impacts, wildfire regimes and wildfire impacts. But also in some cases, it could be that changing wildfire regimes is going to perhaps mean that there will be more prescribed fire on a landscape than what we have now. But what that looks like very much is probably going to vary by landscape and region and ecosystem. And I think at this point, the literature is not really rich enough to tease out within different ecosystem types or landscapes or regions, answering that fundamental question of how much more prescribed fire is really needed to reduce the impacts. That said, that there are, I think, going to be trade-offs, especially in those systems where perhaps more fire on the landscape is going to be needed than what we have now. And for a number of those factors, what those trade-offs aren't necessarily very well studied. And for some, like implications for carbon and emissions, there's some conflicting results. So there needs to be a lot more study, I think, of what some of those trade-offs really are going to be. Now, in terms of how we move forward, I think there are several things that we identified in the study that I think would be helpful for future studies of trying to really address these trade-offs. One is just improvement in data quality and availability for a number of factors. So, both these empirical studies require really high quality long-term data sets that aren't necessarily available everywhere. But even for these modeling studies, you really need good quality data on vegetation and fuels and prescribed fire and all of those things. And this has certainly improved, I think, in the last 20 years, which is why I think we're seeing more and more studies that are able to address some of these questions at larger scale. But there still needs to be continued improvement on this front, I think, of improving the quality of data and making that data widely available. We also found in this study, and I alluded to this a little bit, that some of what makes comparison across these modeling studies difficult is they're using very different methodologies, different models, but even when the same models are used, there's different parameters, different assumptions, different timescales, a whole host of things that that make the studies different. And we found that the degree to which all of those things are reported and easily accessible really does vary. So we thought, for future abilities to sort of compare across studies, it would be really nice if there was just a standard framework for sort of reporting all of these different things. So this might require, for example, revisiting metadata standards for some of these types of studies. So it's really easy for people looking at them to know exactly what went into them. We also, tried to think about, given that there's such conflict in some of the results of studies, it could have the effect of really decreasing the confidence that managers would have in the results. And some things that I think that are needed that would perhaps increase the confidence in some of these modeling results would be, things like sensitivity analysis, so we understand how sensitive modeling results are to certain parameters or certain timescales and things of that nature. Comparing different models in the exact same ecosystem, and more model validation. I think all of this type of work, I recognize it's probably not very exciting for an investigator to dig into, but I think it's really important for just allowing us to really understand the limitations of these models and have more confidence in how to interpret their findings. And then finally, just additional research I think is really needed on some of those trade-offs that we know are there between prescribed fire and wildfire regimes, and especially beyond kind of the more studied ones, which were carbon and ecosystem, or carbon and emissions. Some of the other factors just have received very little study. But also I think there's more work needed in this framework of carbon and emissions as well, because again, the results that we found are still, there's still quite a bit of conflict in the findings. So that's all I have, Sander, and I'll keep my screen up in case I need to go back for to certain slides, but happy to address any questions. I haven't really been paying attention to the time, but it looks like we've got a little time left.
Yeah, thank you. No, you hit the time perfectly. Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. Really interesting. I'm really glad you pulled all this research together, because I think these are the kinds of questions that a lot of people are asking. So diving into some of the questions. So Ramon asked, what would be the most appropriate scientific model to carry out a work on prescribed burns? And I think what he's sort of getting at is you just spent a lot of time looking at a lot of different studies. And I wonder if you could, I know this wasn't the point of your work, but if you could just share any sort of insights into, pros and cons, well, maybe not down to the level of pros and cons, but what you saw in terms of modeling, are there, is it just all over the place, or are there particular models that you, as you were reviewing these, thought were, oh, this is a model that I'm seeing a lot of utility from?
Yeah, and it's really difficult for me to address that question because I, in full disclosure, I am not a modeler and have no experience running any of these models. So, but I think I think more and more there's been some really great papers written about some of the utility of these different models. And so I think, you know, people like Bob Keane have written recently about kind of comparing some of the different ones. And I would love to see more of that type of work that really compares across these different models to really address some of the limitations and assumptions and where they're appropriate in different areas. I think that's really needed. But unfortunately, I'm not the person to address that question. And probably, you know, everyone who has their pet model that they like to use would have a different answer to it, you know.
Yeah, no, thank you. So Jim Utes asked another question, or maybe a little bit more of a comment, getting to the link between fuel type and essentially fire behavior, pointing out that if the primary carrier of the fire is light fuels, fires might carry over large acreages, but would have low intensity. And so did that kind of interplay of vegetation and I guess essentially natural fire regime or fire behavior play into the results at all? I was trying to think about your graphs of the, where one of your early graphs of fire size and intensity, et cetera. Did you see that interplay?
So at this point, I think there's not enough literature to kind of parse out the results by vegetation type, unfortunately. But I think, Jim, you're absolutely right that that we should expect to see differences in different types of ecosystem and the degree to which they're dominated by different fuel types. But I think there needs to be more studies before we can get to the point where we can kind of parse out ecosystem differences.
Yeah, thank you. And there's some clarification here in Jim just pointing out that he wants to make sure we're careful about prescribed fire size and prescribed fire and size. Let's see. Good, and you're already, some folks are mentioning they're already using the study to help the public understand that prescribed fire is a critical tool in forest restoration. So you're already having an impact. That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Julianne. Let's see here. Well, I guess maybe I will take advantage of my seat as moderator and ask around, you highlighted that there was some divergence with emissions. And I know very little about emissions, but it seems to me that there's a qualitative issue as well as a quantitative issue with emissions. And did you see that come up at all? And I guess I'm wondering if that could explain some of the differences. And as a person who promotes prescribed fire, I'd like to think that you get different sort of maybe smaller particles, et cetera, from prescribed fire emissions versus wildfire, but you probably know better than I.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And in a lot of these studies, the sort of the complexity of different types and different constituents of emissions in prescribed fire versus wildfire. I mean, that in and of itself is very complex work. And so, and I don't think it's really incorporated in a lot of these models in a way that would be, you know, informative, or it's just, I mean, it would be difficult, I think, to incorporate it in a lot of these models. And in a lot of the models use, you know, even in the empirical studies, they use very different assumptions for kind of estimating the not only the amount of emissions from wildfire versus prescribed fire, but what they're kind of including in the in that, you know, whether it be just carbon or other constituents or other things. It's sort of all over the board. So, I mean, the short answer is yes. It's like all of that makes it really difficult to kind of compare across studies, which is why I think we're seeing such sort of conflicting results at this point. And so I think I would love to see more studies. And once we get more studies, perhaps you can kind of be able to document what are the implications of some different assumptions you make in terms of the result that you find. I think that would be informative. But at this case, yeah, I'd say that, it's just not, the science is just not quite, there's not enough of a pool of studies, I think, to parse some of that out.
Yep. Yep. No, it does. It feels, just based on some of the numbers you presented, like a little, in some ways it's early days, but we need the information now. So it's good to have this synthesis. Although maybe in 10 years, you'll have to do another. You have to go back and double up. So let's see, I see another note. Ramon's asking, where can I see this webinar again? We will have a recording available on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium webpage. And I can put a link to that in the chat window. And Peter adds something about emissions. Besides quantitative, qualitative, impacts must also be documented, obviously beyond the scope of Dr. Hunter's work, but a good point for future research, that part of it is where that essentially smoke goes. Obviously, when you're doing a prescribed fire, one thinks very carefully about that, but we don't have that choice necessarily with wildfire. So that's probably another attribute that needs more research. Mm-hmm. Let's see, I had a thought on the tip of my tongue for diving in a little bit more. I guess I was thinking in the conversation about the quality of emissions, it's sort of the point you made earlier about wildlife with winners and losers. It's a similar, depends sort of on what part you're looking at or which species you're looking at. And I guess that made me think of other recent, relatively recent TAM reviews. One looking, it was Kaylee's and I forget the other author, but you probably know the paper I'm thinking
Larissa,
of.
Yeah.
Yoakum and Kaylee's, or Kaylee's and Yoakum. That was looking at some more treatments, but I believe it included prescribed fire. And I don't know if you looked back at that paper to see whether, as you took a different set of studies, I think theirs might have been limited to America, whether there was anything that struck out as like, oh, this just sort of falls in line with kind of the directionality they saw, or whether there was something like, oh, when you actually hone in on just prescribed fire versus thinning and prescribed fire and prescribed fire, whether you saw anything different.
No, in fact, I think that's a really, I use that as a guide. I think it's a really nice companion piece, because it's really more looking at the question, but summarizing the literature at that smaller scale, I think. So it's kind of summarizing those studies that looked at, prescribed fire and thinning treatments that were impacted by wildfire, and then had a comparator, which is important, because from all of that, I think we can confidently say that yes, there's benefits to prescribed fire. But what we're doing here is just trying to say, okay, now let's zoom out and look at a bigger area and see if we can't, understand what that means in terms of how much prescribed fire we should have on the landscape.
Great. Well, that's a good place to stop. And Jennifer, I will, when I shut up here, I will add in a link as I close down the webinar to that Kaylee's and Yoakum paper. But Dr. Hunter, I want to thank you again. Great presentation, and even more importantly, great work. I think this is a really important contribution to all of us working on prescribed fire. So thank you very much, and I look forward to everyone joining on future webinars.
Great. Thanks, Sander.
Okay, thank you.